13 masterpieces worth $500 million vanished in 81 minutes. They were cut from their frames with knives. But that's not the most shocking part. The most shocking part is that, by law, these empty frames still hang on the walls. They cannot be taken down. They cannot be replaced. It is the order of a dead woman, given in 1924. You are looking at the most expensive crime scene in history, doomed to forever preserve the evidence against itself. Today, I'll tell you how one woman's obsession with immortality turned her fortress into the perfect trap. But to understand her curse, you must first know what this palace is built on. And it's not marble. Its foundation is money from the opium trade and slave labor. In this house, time has stopped. Not of its own will. It was stopped. There are no white walls, no labels with names. There is nothing here to remind you of a museum. This is a crypt, a beautiful cold crypt, where art is embalmed along with the ambitions of one woman. Every creak of the parquet is an echo of her footsteps. Every ray of light that breaks through the murky glass of the Gothic windows is the same ray that touched her face 100 years ago. The palace breathes, slowly, laboriously, like an old man locked in a room of his memories. It holds its form not by the strength of its stone, but by the power of a single command, given from beyond the grave. Her will wasn't a testament, it was a curse carved in stone, as cruel as the blade of a guillotine. If a single object, a single painting, a single porcelain cup is moved from its place, everything must be sold. The entire collection, every tapestry, every sculpture, every manuscript, everything must be sold at auction in Paris, and the palace itself, emptied, turned to dust. This was her final act of control, absolute, tyrannical control over a future she would never see. And the curators, trembling, obey her to this day. They are not custodians of art. They are priests of her cult. But in this perfect frozen world, there is a room where her will has cracked, where the past burst in and ripped the heart from the stone chest of this house. The Dutch room. It smells of old leather, dark wood, and cold. The light here is always dim, as if afraid to disturb the shadows. The walls are covered in heavy patterned fabric. The space is oppressive. It was designed as a vault, an impregnable sanctuary for the collection's greatest treasures, a silent chapel for two gods, Rembrandt and Vermeer. But today, the most terrifying exhibits in this palace hang on its walls. Empty frames. They are not merely empty. They are gaping wounds, gilded portals to nothingness. Their gleam feels like a mockery. Their emptiness is louder than any sound in this house. Here, on this patch of faded silk, hung Rembrandt's only seascape, a storm frozen on canvas. Now there is a calm, the dead calm of eternal loss. And here the void is even deeper. Vermeer's The Concert, a painting so rare, so perfect, that its price was not measured in money. It was measured in the silence it created around itself. Now, all that remains is a rectangular shadow on the wall, the ghost of harmony. These frames are not just a reminder of a robbery. They are the physical embodiment of a paradox. The iron will of a dead woman forbids hiding these scars, forbids healing the wounds. She ordered time to stand still, and it did. But it froze at the moment of its greatest humiliation. Looking at them, you no longer see a treasury. You see a crime scene, doomed to forever preserve the evidence against itself. And the main question arises not from the glitter of gold, but from this black, sucking void. Was this fortress, built against the world, a grand design, or a cursed tomb from the very beginning? To understand this palace, you have to go beneath it, pass through the marble floors, break through the foundation, and plunge into the cold, dirty earth on which it stands. Because this house is not built on stilts. It is built on money. And the money of the Gilded Age didn't smell of perfume and cigars. It smelled of sweat, blood, and despair. Long before a Titian was hung here, the Gardners didn't trade in art. They traded in dreams. A thick, sticky opium dream that they forced upon China in exchange for silver and silk. 83 of Jack Gardner's grandfather's ships sailed the ocean, their holds filled with poison. Every meter of silk fabric that now lines these walls was bought with thousands of broken lives on the other side of the world. The family's wealth grew on the coughs and delirium of nameless addicts in the squalid ports of Canton. But opium was just the beginning. Their money was as old as sin. They invested it in the plantations of the South, in cotton, picked by the hands of slaves, in land saturated with fear. And then came the age of steam and steel, the age of Isabella's husband, John Gardner, Jr. Jack wasn't a pirate like his grandfather. He was worse. He was a financier. His hands were always clean. He sat in the silence of Boston offices, which smelled of leather and wax, and moved numbers. Numbers that meant trains racing across the country, railroads stitching the continent together with steel threads and squeezing the life out of Irish laborers. He was a director of the Calumet and Hecla Company, a name that sounded like a death sentence for thousands of immigrants lured to America with the promise of a better life. They descended into the darkness of Michigan's copper mines to cough up their lungs for the copper that would later turn into shares on the Boston Stock Exchange. The copper that paid for the splendor of this Venetian courtyard. The copper that bought the Madonna and Child. Isabella's money was different, newer, but not cleaner. Her father, David Stewart, traded in Irish linen, turning a family need into a monopoly. Then he invested in the iron ore mines of Pennsylvania, in ore that became steel in the fiery maws of blast furnaces, steel that required coal, and coal required people. Cheap, disposable people. In 1891, she received her inheritance, $1,750,000, a sum that, in the hands of a woman of that era, was not a fortune, but a weapon. This was her money, not her husband's, her personal arsenal. Their marriage was not a union of hearts. It was a merger of assets. His old money, soaked in opium and blood, and her new money, smelling of iron and coal. This palace, this monument to high art, is the end product of the most ruthless alchemy in history, the transformation of human suffering into gilded stone. Every bas-relief here was paid for with child labor. Every painting was bought with dividends from a suppressed strike. The brilliance of the chandeliers was meant to drown out the screams from the mines. Do not be deceived by the beauty of this place. This is not a temple. It is a laundry. The greatest laundry in the history of Boston, built to wash a century's worth of black money white. Wealth gave her access to Boston, but it couldn't buy her a pass. In this city, which smelled of mothballs and old grudges, she was an outsider, a New York upstart, too loud, too vibrant, too dressed in Parisian gowns. Boston didn't speak, it judged in whispers, and every whisper behind her back was another small stone in the wall the city built around her. They did not accept her. Her husband was one of them, but she, never. She disturbed their silence. She laughed where one was expected to mourn and asked questions where everyone already knew the answers. She was a living reproach to their frozen, puritanical world. And then, her world collapsed. In 1865, her only son died of pneumonia. He wasn't even 2 years old. The silence that Boston so cherished burst into her home and became deafening. The house turned into a mausoleum for one tiny coffin. Her grief was so deep, so black, that doctors feared for her sanity. They advised travel, a change of scenery. They thought it would cure her. They were wrong. It armed her. In Venice, she did not find solace. She found herself. In this sinking, decaying, impossibly beautiful city, she saw a reflection of her own soul. A city that was dying and laughing in the face of death. A city where palazzos turned their blank walls to the filthy canals, but inside, in their courtyards, hid gardens and fountains, fortresses hiding paradise. It was there, in the Palazzo Barbaro, looking at the water caressing the decaying marble, that she found her purpose. She would no longer knock on Boston's doors. She would build her own world, a palace, not just a house, not just a museum, an act of revenge. This would be her answer, to all of them, to all the whispers, all the sideways glances, all the closed doors. She would build her own personal Venice in their gray, proper city, a fortress that would look upon them with blind windows and blank brick walls, impregnable from the outside, cold, alien, just as they were to her. But inside there would be a heart of light, glass, and eternal spring, a courtyard where orchids would bloom even in the dead of a Boston winter, a symbol of life thrown in the face of death, a victory over her son's grave. It was a rebellion against a society that wanted to see her as a quiet widow, a rebellion against an architecture that dictated modesty, and the ultimate rebellion against the patriarchy. This palace would not bear the Gardner name. It would bear her name, Isabella Stewart Gardner. She wouldn't just preserve a collection. She would immortalize herself. Not the family name she married into, but the identity she forged in the fire of loss and contempt. She would return to Boston not as a supplicant. She would return as a conqueror. And her weapons would not be cannons, but marble, tapestries, and paintings by Titian. She would build a fortress of her will in the middle of their swamp, and they would come to her, all of them, on her terms. This wasn't a construction site. This was a war. And on the battlefield, amid the mud, the shouts, and the grinding of metal, she stood. Not in a ball gown, but in simple clothes, a hard hat on her head, and a power in her eyes that frightened the construction workers more than the risk of falling from the scaffolding. Her war was fought on all fronts. The first to fall was the architect. Willard Sears thought he would be building a house. He was mistaken. She turned him into her draftsman, an obedient hand that merely transferred her designs to paper. She didn't give him instructions. She brought entire Gothic windows from Europe, stone balconies, Romanesque capitals, dumped them in the mud, and pointed a finger. Incorporate this here. He argued. He spoke of the laws of physics, of the impossibility of joining 15th century stone with 20th century Boston brick. She didn't listen. Her will was stronger than the laws of physics. Then she declared war on the workers. She was their shadow, their curse. She inspected every mix of mortar, every single brick laid. If the shade was wrong, if a line seemed incorrect to her, she didn't ask for a redo. She took a hammer and smashed their work to dust. She made them rebuild columns again and again until they stood just as she alone envisioned. They hated her and feared her. She paid them well, but she didn't demand skill. She demanded submission to her obsession. The press opened a third front. The Boston newspapers, reveling in their own righteousness, dubbed her project Gardner's Folly. They wrote about a mad widow squandering her late husband's fortune on a pile of European stone. For her, every headline was not an insult, but fuel. The louder they laughed, the higher her walls grew. Even the land itself rebelled against her. She chose the most forsaken spot in the city, the fens, a swamp, a marsh that couldn't bear weight. Engineers warned that the palace would sink. She ordered 735 spruce piles to be driven into the ground, 10-meter trunks that went deep, biting into the unstable soil, creating an artificial foundation where one could not exist. She waged war on the very geology of Massachusetts, and while this dirty physical war was being fought here, her generals were fighting another battle, a secret one, across the ocean. Her agents, like Bernard Berenson, an art historian with the soul of a merchant, scoured Europe. They bought up everything: altars from abandoned churches, portraits of impoverished aristocrats, entire rooms from ruined palazzos. It was a race against time, against the U.S. government, which was about to impose predatory tariffs on imported art. Ships laden with stolen history hurried to the port of Boston. Every crate containing a painting or a sculpture was an act of smuggling in the name of a grand design. She risked everything. She sold stocks, mortgaged bonds. Her husband's relatives begged her to stop, not to disgrace the Gardner name. But she was no longer Mrs. Gardner. She was the queen on the construction site of her own Versailles, a queen waging war against everyone, against logic, against public opinion, against nature, and against the law. And she was winning. Stone by stone, her folly took shape. Her fortress rose from the swamp. January 1st, 1903. Night. The frosty Boston air is cut by the sounds of music and the clinking of glasses. From the windowless brick box that the newspapers had called a folly, golden light pours out. She had won. Inside, in the courtyard that still smelled of fresh plaster, 50 musicians from the Boston Symphony Orchestra played for 200 guests. Champagne flowed like a river. Isabella, breaking all rules of propriety, did not greet her guests at the entrance. She waited upstairs, and when everyone had gathered, she slowly descended the grand staircase, alone, the center of all attention. This was not a reception. This was her coronation. The palace came to life. It ceased to be a construction site and became the most bohemian, most sought-after salon in America. Everyone who was rejected by, or felt constrained by, puritanical Boston flocked here. Artists like John Singer Sargent, whose portraits were too daring. Writers like Henry James, whose prose was too complex. Dancers whose movements were considered sinful. Here, under the gazes of Madonnas and Roman emperors, they found refuge. Her home became a stage, and she, its principal director. It was a triumph, complete, resounding. She had built her own world and forced everyone to come to it. She filled the void left by her son's death with the noise of parties, with applause, with admiring glances. But what happened when the last guest had left? When the music fell silent and the servants extinguished the candles? Silence. The very silence she had fled from her entire life returned. It grew thicker, heavier in these vast, echoing halls. The echo of her lonely footsteps was swallowed by the high ceilings. The paintings, which were conversation partners by day, turned into silent judges by night. She built a palace to escape her loneliness, but in the end, she had only erected the most magnificent walls in the world for it. And then her body betrayed her. 1919. A blow. Sudden, like a gunshot in the silence. A stroke. The iron will that had bent steel and moved stone was now trapped in a fragile, disobedient shell. Her right side was paralyzed. The voice that had commanded hundreds of workers was reduced to an indistinct whisper. She spent the last 5 years of her life here. A prisoner, in a wheelchair, slowly being pushed through the halls of her own triumph. She could see her treasures, but she could not touch them. She could look at her ever-blooming garden, but she could not inhale the fragrance of its flowers. The palace that had been her fortress against a hostile world became her prison, her sanctuary, her cell. Every painting, every tapestry, every statue that she had brought here with such passion now mocked her helplessness. She was a queen in exile in her own kingdom. She had built the perfect gilded cage, and only when the door slammed shut behind her did she realize she had locked herself inside. 1924. She died. In her bedroom, on the 4th floor, overlooking the swamp she had conquered. Her body had finally released her indomitable spirit. But Isabella Gardner had no intention of leaving. She simply changed her tactics. When her lawyer gathered the trustees and relatives to read the will, the air in the room was heavy with anticipation. They were thinking about money, about stocks, about the future. They were not prepared for what they heard. This was not a legal document. It was an ultimatum from the grave. She was leaving her palace and everything in it to the people. For the education and enjoyment of the public forever. A generous gesture, but it was followed by poison, the conditions, as rigid as prison bars. Nothing, ever, was to be changed. Not just the paintings, everything, the arrangement of the furniture, the height at which each portrait hangs, the book left open on a small table, the Chinese vase in the corner, even the faded photograph of her husband. Every object was fixed in space by her will. The collection could not be added to. Nothing could be sold. Nothing could be put into storage. The house had to remain frozen, to become a drop of amber, preserving a moment of her life. Forever. And then came the curse. The clause that made the blood of the men who ran Boston run cold if the trustees were to violate even one of these conditions, if even one teacup were moved, if even one painting were replaced. The entire collection, down to the last nail, must be immediately gathered, sent to Paris, and sold at public auction. The palace was to be emptied, and the money given to Harvard University. Silence fell in the room. They understood. She didn't trust them. Not a single one. Not their taste, not their judgment, not their future generations. She knew that after her death, people with new ideas would come. They would want to improve, modernize, reimagine. They would want to hang the paintings on white walls, arrange them chronologically, turn her home into an ordinary, soulless museum. With this will, she launched a preemptive strike. She stripped them of their power. She transformed future curators not into creators, but into priests, into eternal guardians of her will, doomed merely to dust the surfaces and ensure that nothing was ever moved. It was her final, most perfect act of control. She could not live forever, but she could make her world stand still. She won the battle for immortality, turning her home into a mausoleum and herself into its invisible, ever-present mistress. She had created a perfect, unchanging organism, but in her quest to protect it from change, she made it fragile, vulnerable to the one force she could not have foreseen, a crude, violent intrusion from a world that kept moving while her palace slept. The night of March 18th, 1990. Boston was celebrating St. Patrick's Day. The streets were filled with noise and drunken revelry. But here, behind the palace walls, a dead silence reigned, the very same kind Isabella had willed. At 1:24 in the morning, 2 men approached the service door. They were dressed in police uniforms, real or almost real. They rang the bell. The night guard, young and inexperienced, saw them on the monitor. Cops, he broke the cardinal rule. Never open the door. But they said they were responding to a call. Someone had reported a disturbance in the courtyard. He believed them. He opened it. It was the first crack in the armor Isabella had spent a century building. The robbers were not like movie villains. They were calm, methodical. They told the guard there was a warrant for his arrest, ordered him to step away from the alarm panel. They put him in handcuffs. Then they did the same to the second guard, who was making his rounds. They took them to the basement, cuffed them to pipes, and wrapped their mouths with duct tape. "Don't give us any trouble," they said, "and in a year, we'll send you a reward." They were alone. The entire palace, with all its treasures, was at their mercy. 81 minutes, an eternity. They didn't rush. They knew where to go. They went up to the second floor, straight to the Dutch room. They didn't try to carefully remove the paintings from the walls. Their movements were rough, barbaric. They threw Vermeer's The Concert onto the marble floor. The glass shattered. Then they took a knife, a small, sharp knife, and they began to cut. They cut the canvases directly from their frames, tearing threads that were 300 years old. This wasn't a robbery. It was a desecration, a surgical operation performed by a butcher. They cut out the heart of the collection, Rembrandt's only seascape, his self-portrait, works by Flink and Degas. They walked through the palace as if they owned it. They took the finial from the staff of a Napoleonic flag, crudely tearing off the eagle. They took an ancient Chinese ritual vessel. Their choices were strange, chaotic. They ignored Titian's work hanging in the next room, the museum's most valuable painting. Why? No one knows. At 2:45 in the morning, they left. As quietly as they had arrived, they vanished into the night, taking 13 works of art with them. $500 million. In the morning, the world was shaken. Reporters' cameras, police tape, the faces of art historians, twisted in horror. A catastrophe. But it was more than that. It was the final act of a drama. The iron will of Isabella Gardner, which had outlived her by 66 years, collided with a harsh, merciless reality. She had been able to protect her home from her friends, from the trustees, from time itself. But she couldn't protect it from two men with a knife and duct tape. That night, they didn't just steal paintings. They stole a piece of her soul, frozen in paint. They cut the heart out of her stone body, leaving only gaping wounds behind. We're here again, in the Dutch room. Time has passed, but here it doesn't heal. It only seeps deeper into the wounds, the empty frames. Today, they mean more than ever. They are the final verdict, a silent sentence passed on both a great ambition and a great loss. Their emptiness is not an absence. It is a presence, the presence of her will, which even after the catastrophe proved stronger than common sense. Her iron command, issued from the grave, forbids hiding these scars, forbids hanging other paintings in their place, forbids even the removal of these gilded testaments to humiliation from the wall. The frames must hang. Forever. They have become a monument, not only to the stolen art, but to Isabella herself, to her stubbornness, to her tyrannical need for control, which outlived both her and her treasures. She wanted to freeze a moment in time, and she succeeded. But she froze it at the point of tragedy. The museum is alive, but it lives with its ghosts. It breathes, but every breath it takes is a draft blowing through the empty frames. The voices of thousands of visitors are drowned out by the deafening silence of what is no longer here. The obsessive pursuit of immortality through absolute control is the cruelest of paradoxes. In creating an eternal monument to her will, she simultaneously made it incredibly fragile, vulnerable to chaos, to chance, to two thieves in fake police uniforms. She built a fortress against entropy, but it was this very fortress that became her Achilles' heel. Isabella Gardner's legacy is not just the Titian on the wall. It is not just the ever-blooming garden. Her true legacy lies in the agonizing question born here, in the dim light of the Dutch room. What is immortality? An incorruptible, perfect creation, frozen in time, as its creator wished? Or is it its living, wounded history? A history that continues to bleed, to change, and to acquire new, tragic meanings long after its author is gone. There is no answer. There is only the echo of her voice, resounding in the emptiness, and the eternal silent scream of these frames, asking everyone who looks at them, was eternity worth such a price? This palace is not just a collection of art. It is a duel between one woman's will and time itself, frozen in amber, a duel in which the victor's scars proved more important than the triumph itself. What is ultimately more valuable? The incorruptible creation as the author intended it, or its wounded, living history that continues to be written before our very eyes? And where is the line between preserving a legacy and embalming its soul? This dialogue isn't over. It's just beginning. Share your thoughts in the comments. They will become part of this story. And if our work has made you think, please support us. Your subscription and like are the fuel for new stories.